The late great President James Monroe has to be very pleased because his doctrine is back and maybe, if you can believe it, bigger than ever.
We will also deny adversaries' ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities in our hemisphere. Past administrations perpetuated the belief that the Monroe Doctrine had expired. They were wrong. The Monroe Doctrine is in effect, and it is stronger than ever under the Trump corollary. A common sense restoration of our power and prerogatives in this hemisphere, consistent with U.S. interests.
Hey everyone, I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and a revival of the Monroe Doctrine is indeed a crucial element of Trump's new national security strategy. It's important to understand why this is so essential and why the critics who think it's misguided or even dangerous are so wrong. So what is the Monroe Doctrine? Well, that story begins in the 1820s when James Monroe was president of the United States, a very impressive guy, the last founding father who was president, former governor of Virginia, former senator from Virginia, former ambassador to both Britain and France, former Secretary of State, and Pete Hegseth would appreciate this, former Secretary of War. Now, the trouble begins in 1821 when the Tsar says, look, Russia has these outposts on the Pacific coast, Sitka, now in Alaska, other places, and we are declaring unilaterally that foreign shipping can't come within 115 miles of these outposts. And by the way, they now constitute an exclusive Russian economic zone. And we react very strongly against this. The Secretary of State at the time, one of the greatest statesmen in American history, John Quincy Adams, says, no, not in our backyard, in terms that anticipate what would eventually become the Monroe Doctrine. The bigger issue at this time is that the Spanish Empire is disintegrating. It's losing its grip on the Western Hemisphere. This has created the predicate for the rise of republics in Latin America. And our fear is that continental powers that are conservative, the so-called Holy Alliance, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they don't like republics. So they might come and intervene for ideological reasons. And also, they might colonize these areas just for their own purposes. This is considered by us a national security threat, a cultural threat, a territorial threat, a demographic threat, and an ideological threat. So we don't want it to happen. And you know what? Neither do the Brits. They don't want to be excluded economically from these areas by other European powers, and they consider the United States a potential partner. So the British foreign minister at the time, a guy named Canning, comes to us and said, hey guys, why don't we get together and say that none of these other European powers can come into these areas. And we think about that for a while. We string the British along, and then we decide, you know what? This is our hemisphere. We're going to issue this declaration on our own. And James Monroe, in his annual message to Congress in 1823, sets out what will become the doctrine known by his name forevermore. Monroe issues forth with these famous words, quote, the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Now, Trump's new national security strategy has been criticized for being too tough on the Europeans, and there's something to that, but James Monroe was also pretty tough. Monroe says that the European nations represent a threat by their very nature. He says the political system of the Allied powers, that's referring to the Europeans, is essentially different from that of America. We owe it, he goes on to say, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. As you might guess, the Europeans don't like it. The great Austrian statesman Prince Metternich said that the Monroe Doctrine, quote, astonished Europe by a new act of revolt, more unprovoked, fully as audacious, and no less dangerous than the American Revolution itself. The Tsar said the Monroe Doctrine merits, quote, only the most profound contempt, close quote. But you know what? The Tsar backed off that unilateral declaration he had made about those Pacific outposts. Now, look, for decades and decades, we weren't militarily strong enough to truly resist European encroachments on our hemisphere. But ironically, the British, whose interests were also involved, as I mentioned earlier, de facto enforced the Monroe Doctrine for us. But as soon as we were strong enough, we began to enforce it ourselves. There was a French intervention in Mexico in the 1860s. And as soon as we were no longer distracted by the Civil War, we helped pressure France to leave. We got Germany to back down when it was sniffing around Venezuela, sound familiar, during a debt crisis in 1902. This led to the so-called Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, named after President Teddy Roosevelt, that said we could deploy an international police force when Latin American governments were failing. All this was extremely important. The Monroe Doctrine excluded any real geopolitical challenges in the Western Hemisphere, meant the Western Hemisphere, as far as we were concerned, was largely peaceful and allowed us to muster our strength until we became a world power. But lately, we've fallen down. Since George H.W. Bush toppled a president of Panama who was a drug runner, and since Bill Clinton's intervention in Haiti in 1994, we've really let all this go. We thought it was the end of history. We thought this was too grubby. Our own backyard wasn't as important as other regions in the world, and we've been paying a price. China is now Latin America's second largest trading partner after the United States and has increased its influence on all fronts in the region. Russia has relationships with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, and has increased its covert operations in Mexico. And Hezbollah has a notable presence in Latin America. What the Trump strategy calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is all about pushing back against all this. Now, truth be told, the Trump corollary is just a repeat of the so-called Lodge corollary from 1912, named after a senator named Henry Cabot Lodge, and that extended the Monroe Doctrine, said it's not just about excluding European governments, it's about excluding non-European governments and non-European private concerns whenever they might be on the verge of exercising practical power of control. And we've seen Trump act on this corollary even before it was called a corollary, when very early in his first year goes to Panama, says, look, guys, you got to curtail the Chinese influence in this country. Panama, obviously really important to us because of the canal there, and Panama goes along, says it's no longer going to be part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, a really important victory there for U.S. national security interests. We see this tendency, too, in Trump's pressure campaign against a Maduro regime in Venezuela that is aligned with China, Russia, and Iran. Now, it's no secret that Trump's actions oftentimes feel as though they're new and different. They're a break with tradition and so-called norms. But here, in seeking to revive the Monroe Doctrine, he is returning to a very traditional American approach to our side of the Atlantic, and it's a very good thing. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.